Picture this. It's 424 BC. In the heart of Sparta, a crowd of 2,000 men stands gathered in the open. They're smiling. On their heads sit garlands of flowers, symbols of victory, of gratitude, of freedom. These men are Spartan Helots, state-owned slaves, and today they believe they've won the greatest lottery imaginable: life itself. The Spartan government made them a promise. The bravest Helots, the ones who had fought hardest for their masters, would be rewarded with freedom. 2,000 names were chosen. 2,000 men stepped forward. They were allowed to march through the temples, cheered by citizens, breathing free air for what felt like the first time in their lives. And then the sun went down. By the next morning, every single one of them was gone. No bodies were found floating in the Eurotas River. No mass graves were dug beyond the city walls. Nothing, just absence. The historian Thucydides gives them the only obituary they would ever receive. The Spartans eliminated them, and no one knew how each man died. It was the perfect crime. A mass execution carried out so cleanly, it left no evidence, only a sudden hole in the population. Sparta didn't just kill these men, it erased them. Before we go any deeper into these buried stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden sides of history, consider liking this video and subscribing. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love the idea that we're exploring the ancient world together from every corner of the globe. Because this single incident tells you almost everything you need to know about the real Sparta. Forget the movie 300. Forget the slow-motion heroics and speeches about freedom. The Spartan state was not a defender of liberty. It was a machine built for one purpose: controlling a hostage population. Those 2,000 men weren't killed because they were criminals. They were killed because they were exceptional. The Spartans understood a dark psychological truth. The slave who believes he deserves freedom is the slave most likely to lead a revolt. So the promise of emancipation wasn't mercy. It was a filter. A trap designed to identify the strongest, bravest, most charismatic Helots, so they could be quietly removed. This is the side of Sparta that never makes it into the highlight reel. We idolize the Spartan hoplite, the disciplined, invincible warrior. But we rarely ask the uncomfortable questions. Who grew the food that fueled his training? Who polished his armor? Who carried his shield on the long march to Thermopylae? The answer is always the same: the Helot. For every Spartan citizen, there were roughly 7 Helots standing nearby, watching, waiting, resenting. Sparta's economy wasn't just built on slavery. It was a pyramid scheme of violence. Unlike other Greek city-states where slaves were bought and sold as individuals, the Helots were an entire conquered people, enslaved en masse on their own land. They had families, villages, traditions, and, most dangerously, a shared memory of freedom. A purchased slave from across the sea stands alone. A Helot stands beside brothers. That made them terrifying. So the Spartans lived in permanent fear. They were the most feared warriors in Greece, yet they were prisoners inside their own city, afraid to leave their homes unguarded, afraid to relax, afraid to sleep too deeply. They didn't train endlessly just to fight foreign enemies. They trained to fight the people working in their fields. This fear shaped everything. It gave birth to the Krypteia, a state-sponsored death squad of young men sent to hunt Helots. It required Sparta to formally declare war on its own workforce every single year, just to make murder legal in the eyes of the gods. To understand how things became this horrific, we need to go back. Back before the massacres, back before the terror, back to the original crime. The tragedy of Sparta didn't begin with a slaughter. It began with a theft so massive it consumed an entire country. Messenia. Geography explains everything. Sparta sits in the Eurotas Valley, rocky, harsh, unforgiving. It produces tough people but not abundance. But just beyond the Taygetos Mountains to the west lies Messenia. In the ancient world, Messenia was paradise. Rich soil, reliable rainfall, legendary harvests. It was the breadbasket of the Peloponnese. To a hungry Spartan warlord staring down from the mountains, it didn't look like a neighbor. It looked like a feast. In the late 8th century BC, Sparta made a fateful choice. They didn't trade with Messenia, they invaded it. The First Messenian War wasn't a quick clash. It dragged on for 20 brutal years, a generational grinder that revealed the terrifying endurance of the Spartan war machine. They didn't just want victory, they wanted erasure. And when the fighting finally ended around 720 BC, Sparta did something unprecedented. Most Greek city-states took land, demanded tribute, and went home. Sparta stayed. They annexed everything, every field, every olive grove, every vineyard. The land became Spartan property, and then, inevitably, so did the people. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were stripped of citizenship, rights, and identity, reclassified, reduced to a single word, Helots. And that distinction changed everything. Greek slavery usually worked like livestock trading. Individuals captured abroad, sold in markets, isolated by language and culture. A slave in Athens might come from Thrace or Anatolia. But Helots were enslaved where they lived. A Helot plowed the same fields his grandfather once owned. Only now he had to hand over half of everything he produced to a master who lived beyond the mountains and had never touched a plow in his life. The poet Tyrtaeus, writing propaganda for Sparta, captured their existence perfectly. Like donkeys under crushing loads, forced by pain to deliver half the fruits of the land to their masters. Imagine the psychological weight of that. You're not displaced. You're occupied. You speak the same language as your oppressor. Worship the same gods. And remember vividly that freedom was stolen within living memory. Sparta hadn't conquered sheep. It had swallowed a wolf. And holding that wolf down would cost them everything. The consequences of that theft didn't stay buried for long. A few generations later, the pressure finally exploded. In the mid-7th century BC, the Second Messenian War erupted, and it nearly destroyed Sparta. This wasn't a minor uprising. It was a full-scale revolution. Led by the legendary, almost mythic figure Aristomenes, the Helots fought with the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. They abandoned traditional battlefield rules and turned the mountains into weapons, launching ambushes and guerrilla raids that bled the Spartan army dry. The hunters became the hunted. History often glosses over just how close Sparta came to total collapse during this war. They lost open battles. Morale shattered. At one point, retreat back into Laconia and the loss of Messenia entirely seemed inevitable. What saved Sparta wasn't superior tactics. It was obsession. Poets like Tyrtaeus whipped the population into a fanatic trance, glorifying sacrifice and obedience. The state responded by militarizing everything: childhood, family, identity. Society itself was reshaped into a permanent garrison. This trauma permanently scarred the Spartan psyche. They learned a brutal lesson. If you want to hold a conquered people, you must never loosen your grip. Holding a wolf by the ears requires both hands, forever. This is the moment the Sparta of legend was born. The Messenian Wars triggered the Lycurgan reforms, the radical restructuring that created the agage, the austere lifestyle, and the total devotion to military discipline we recognize today. But this wasn't a noble pursuit of perfection. It was a survival response. They were sitting on a volcano. The conquest of Messenia created a twisted economic paradox. Sparta became the richest state in Greece by land and agricultural output. Yet individual Spartans owned almost nothing. All wealth flowed into a system designed for one purpose: sustaining the army required to guard that wealth. It was a closed loop of violence. They needed the army to control the Helots. They needed the Helots to feed the army. And the Helots were never just labor. They were the enemy. So the Spartan state ruled through terror. Not occasional cruelty, but systematic, ritualized fear. Physical chains weren't enough. The mind had to be broken. Which brings us to one of the most grotesque innovations in ancient history. Every year, Sparta declared war on its own slaves. Each autumn, 5 men called the ephors, officials who held power even above the kings, took office. Their first act wasn't a speech or a ceremony. It was a formal declaration of war against the Helots. This wasn't symbolic. It was legal, religious, binding. Why would a government declare war on the people who grew its food? Because the Greeks feared miasma, spiritual pollution caused by murder. Killing in peacetime risked divine punishment. Plagues, earthquakes, famine. But killing an enemy in war? That was duty. By keeping Sparta in a permanent legal state of war with the Helots, every Spartan citizen was granted moral immunity. A Helot could be killed in a field, on a road, or in his home, and the killer remained ritually pure. Laconia and Messenia became a free fire zone, but terror wasn't only physical. It was psychological, cultural, relentless. Humiliation was policy. Helots were forced to wear a kune, a crude cap made of dog skin. In Greek symbolism, dogs were scavengers. By forcing Helots to dress in dog hide, Sparta marked them visually as subhuman. Their cloaks were rough animal skins, ensuring they looked wild and degraded next to the polished red cloaks of Spartan citizens. Plutarch describes another ritual, even darker. At the communal mess halls, Spartan men would drag Helots inside and force them to drink unmixed wine until they were violently drunk. In Greek culture, that was barbaric, a sign of total lack of self-control. The intoxicated Helots were then forced to sing obscene songs and stumble through grotesque dances. Then Spartan boys were brought in to watch. "Look," the men would say, "this is what a Helot is. This is what lack of discipline looks like." The Helots' degradation became an educational tool. Their suffering taught Spartan children superiority. At the same time, it crushed Helot self-worth. Treated like animals long enough, people begin to believe they are animals. Even strength was regulated. Helots had to be strong enough to work, but not strong enough to inspire fear. If one looked too fit, too confident, too intelligent, he was marked for death. Masters were even fined if their Helots appeared too well fed. They were bred for endurance and culled for ambition. This created a horrific intimacy. Masters and slaves lived side by side, dependent on one another, separated by an ocean of blood and law. A Spartan relied on Helots for everything: bread, wine, armor, legacy, yet had to wake each morning prepared to kill them. Sparta became a surveillance state, but fields are wide, mountains are dark. Fear alone isn't enough. So Sparta created a monster to police monsters. If the annual declaration of war provided permission to kill, the agoge provided the weapon. Popular culture portrays the Agogge as a heroic boot camp. Strip away the myth, and it looks more like institutionalized abuse. Boys were taken from their mothers at 7, starved, beaten, forced to sleep on reeds they gathered themselves. The goal wasn't strength, it was the destruction of empathy. And the final exam wasn't the battlefield, it was the Krypteia. Often mistranslated as a secret service, the Krypteia was closer to a death squad. Only the most promising and ruthless young men were chosen. They were sent into Helot territory with no armor, no shield, no spear, only a dagger. By day they hid. They watched Helots work. They noted who stood tall, who organized others, who showed confidence. At night, they hunted. The strongest, the bravest, the potential leaders. Throats were cut in silence. Bodies left behind. Killers vanished before dawn. This wasn't warfare. Plutarch called it a culling. It taught a single lesson. Honor applies only to equals. For everyone else, there are no rules. The Krypteia served two purposes. First, it shattered the Helots' ability to resist. No one was ever safe. Not in the fields, not in their homes, not even in sleep. Invisible eyes might be watching. Stand out, and you died. So Helots learned to shrink themselves, to hide their strength, to smother leadership before Sparta could cut it out of them. Second, it finalized the transformation of the Spartan citizen. Before a man could take his place in the assembly or the battle line, he had to prove he could do the state's dirtiest work. He had to spill blood in the shadows. This bound Sparta's ruling class together through shared guilt. Every full citizen was, in effect, a veteran of a secret war against his own workforce. Historians still debate how constant the Krypteia was. But you don't control a population that outnumbers you for centuries with a handful of symbolic killings. This was sustained state terror. Sparta believed it had built a perfect system, laws, training, fear, all locked into place. But systems built on tension are brittle. They can resist pressure from one direction. When the ground itself moves, they shatter. In 464 BC, the earth moved. The ground beneath the Eurotas Valley didn't just shake, it liquefied. To the Spartans, deeply superstitious, earthquakes were the footsteps of Poseidon himself. And that morning, the god arrived in fury. The quake was catastrophic. Villages collapsed. The gymnasium, filled with boys in training, crumbled, burying an entire generation. Ancient sources claim up to 20,000 died in seconds. Sparta lay in ruins. In most cities, panic would follow. Rescue, mourning, chaos. King Archidamus chose something else. Standing amid the dust, he realized the prison walls were gone. Guards were dead. Prisoners were watching. So he ordered the trumpets to sound for war. It was cold genius. Archidamus knew the Helots would see the dust clouds and interpret them as a divine signal to rise. And they did. Armed bands rushed toward the city, hoping to finish what the earth had begun. They arrived to find Spartans already formed in a desperate phalanx, standing over the bodies of their own children. The surprise attack failed, but the great Helot revolt had begun. For a decade, Sparta bled. Rebels retreated to Mount Aetholm and turned it into a fortress. The greatest soldiers in Greece couldn't dislodge runaway slaves. Desperate, humiliated, and short on manpower, Sparta did the unthinkable. They asked Athens for help. 4,000 Athenian hoplites marched south, men from a democracy, curious and free. When they saw Helots fighting for liberty and Spartans fighting to re-enslave them, something cracked. Sparta panicked, fearing democratic ideas would spread, They dismissed the Athenians publicly while keeping other allies. It was an insult that shattered the alliance and paved the road to the Peloponnesian War. Sparta would rather lose wars than risk freedom becoming contagious. The earthquake didn't destroy Sparta, it exposed it. The Helots weren't broken, they were waiting, and the demographic clock was ticking. Too many Spartans were dead, too few were born, yet the myth endured. Why? Because of Thermopylae. The image is burned into culture. Leonidas, 300 Spartans, bronze against millions, a monument to freedom. But there's a ghost in the frame. Herodotus tells us that at Plataea, for every Spartan soldier, 7 Helots marched with him. 7. Logistics, supplies, light infantry. At Thermopylae, they were there too, carrying gear, cooking food, dying under Persian arrows. The epitaph honors only citizens. The slaves were erased again, and fear played a role. If Spartans ran, their slaves would see. The illusion of invincibility would collapse. They had to perform perfection, or risk a knife in the back. This dependence poisoned the system. Sparta needed Helots, feared Helots, and couldn't function without them. And then math caught up. In 480 BC, Sparta had about 8,000 full citizens. By 371 BC, fewer than 1,000 remained. Aristotle called it oliganthropia, a shortage of men. Citizenship required land contributions. Fail to pay, lose status, wealth concentrated. Families fell out. Blood purity strangled numbers. By the time Thebes challenged Sparta, the ratio of Helots to citizens may have been 20 to 1. Enter Epaminondas. At Leuctra, he shattered Spartan tactics with physics, not heroics. 50 men deep, he crushed the elite line. 400 Spartan citizens died in an afternoon. Then he did something no one dared. He marched into Messenia, not to conquer, but to free it. Helots were declared citizens. Land returned. A new city, Messamum, rose behind massive walls. The system collapsed overnight. Without Helots, Sparta starved. It didn't fall in flames. It shrank, became a museum. Roman tourists came to watch boys whipped for entertainment. The people Sparta tried to erase outlived them, and that leaves us with a question. Why do we still worship Sparta? From gym shirts to movie screens, the Spartan mirage persists. From a distance, it looks like order, strength, purity. Up close, it smells like blood. Sparta achieved stability, the stability of a graveyard. By enslaving the Helots, they enslaved themselves. They froze their society, sacrificed art, philosophy, and freedom to maintain control. Athens gave us democracy and debate. Sparta gave us a warning. The Helots remind us of something deeper than discipline, the human need for dignity. Hunted, humiliated, erased, they endured. They waited. And when the walls cracked, they reclaimed their world. Strength isn't rigidity, it's adaptability. So remember the shadow behind the shield. Remember the price of perfection. And ask yourself, would you rather live in a state that is feared or one that is free?